Early memory for me growing up in Lewis was quite often if we were driving in the countryside and we'd look out on the moorland, there were what looked like great patches of it on fire. And it was a kind of systematic burning of patches of heather. But my reaction as a child was to alert my parents and say, my goodness, there's a fire. We need to get the fire brigade or somebody out because it looks like it's out of control. It was perfectly under control. It was explained to me that it was something that quite often crofters would do in order to get rid of a lot of the dead heather, and the kind of systematic burning would encourage fresh growth and roots to come up, which is much better for livestock and for grazing. But nevertheless, it is an old and a hardwired human reaction too. When you see or feel or sense fire, particularly in nature, you think, what's going on there? And that's what happens in the burning bush episode. And there was more going on to it. It was not just some strange, mystical, unexplained natural phenomenon. It was almost certainly a deliberate act of God in order to get Moses' attention and engage him in this dialogue. And just like the crofters knew what they were doing, God knows what he's doing in this instance. And it's a story that we all know, and it's on our emblems, but it's still loaded with mystery. So my intention today isn't to plumb the depths and take all the mystery out of it. It is, what I think is helpful about this is to try and learn something about the identity of God, because what the burning bush, I would submit to you, is really about is God coming to Moses and showing him what he is truly like. And if you like, what Moses can bank on that is true about God, and that's actually going to be helpful and practical to him in his life. And I think we can all use that as learning what God is like in a way that's actually going to help us and be practical to us. Where this comes in the story is so important. The burning bush is not a random theophany just for the sake of producing something miraculous or having a really philosophical conversation about the nature of God. It comes at a low point, really, in Moses' life. You see, since the last time, we thought about last week how if you like, the naturalness of the cycle of slavery and evil and man's inhumanity to man in the world, and how God supernaturally breaks into that to bring something different in terms of justice and salvation. But that was when we used him being found in the basket in the river as a baby. Since then, he grew up in the house of Egypt. He had a sense of his own identity as a Hebrew Israelite. And when he saw, this is all in the context of his people being oppressed and enslaved, and when he saw one of his countrymen being oppressed and enslaved, he went over and he killed one of the Egyptian slave masters. It was found out, and he basically went on the run because he felt like his life was in danger. So we went from Moses, who grew up, if you like, full of political power, probably well-educated, clearly had some sort of sense of internal justice, makes this massive blunder, and now he's a shepherd working on his father-in-law. If you like, he's hiding out in the woods. He's out of the picture and out of the story, and that's where we find this. And overhanging this, as I said last week, Exodus is really a continuation of the story in Genesis. The story in Genesis opens with God making everything, making humanity, if you like, as the apex of, or the pinnacle of the creation, entering into a connection with them, and then all that going horribly wrong. And we're continually left asking the question, is God's design of living in existence with in blessing and fellowship and connection with human beings in a land where there's a justice and it's plentiful for everyone, is that ever going to be restored? Is there any hope for that? And Exodus is a kind of continuation and looking to answer that question in its own way through the specific story of Moses and his people. So I want to take three aspects of what I think we learn about God's identity and how God, if you like, shows up to answer that question and to try and bring some sort of restorative solution to the predicament that Moses and his people find themselves in. Firstly, he shows himself to be a God who hears and acts. And then secondly, he shows himself to be a God who, after he acts, he also delivers and saves. And then he shows himself to be a God who gives people hope, probably the thing that we all need to survive. Firstly, he shows himself to be a God who hears and who acts. Now, we have chapter 3, and Moses sees the burning bush. He goes over to it, and the Lord says in verse 7, I've seen indeed the misery of my people in Egypt, and I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up out of that land. God, it's almost like we get this impression at different times that the collective cry of misery and pain and suffering of his people rises up in this great cloud and reaches God's ears, and it's something that he's unable to resist or stand back from and not do anything about. And so Moses might well have been, especially when he was in that situation, he might well have been in the situation thinking, I don't think God is particularly moved or interested in the plight we find ourselves in. And we thought a bit about that last week, how things can often seem as though they are going from bad to worse, and there isn't much intervention from God. And we sometimes as Christians, certainly plenty of other people, question where on earth is God in the midst of all of that. And God comes to Moses and he says to him, I have heard them crying out, and I'm concerned about their suffering. And we can have many ideas of God which are somewhat stoic, distant, indifferent. And here, when God is deciding to reveal who he is to Moses, he says, I don't only hear, it's not just that I am God Almighty, that's another name that he's given Moses previously, El Shaddai, and I'm everywhere always at one time, and I have supreme power, and I rule over the universe, and so that means that I have the power to hear whatever's going on, whatever. Beyond that, what I hear when it is pierced with a cry of injustice, I'm actually concerned about that. That actually moves me. And it doesn't just move me in the way sometimes you and I might be moved when we maybe see one of those adverts that pulls at your heartstrings on the television, designed for a charity, and moves God in a way where he says, I'm not going to stop there. I'm actually going to pick myself up and I'm going to do something about it. And so he acts, and I've come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land. And Moses enters into this dialogue because Moses finds this to be beyond belief. Maybe he doesn't feel like he's got much evidence that God is involved in the picture up to this point. And God begins to assure him based on his own character and identity. You see, he says, I'm the God who hears and who acts. And you are going to be able to take that to the bank based on what you're going to see happen. Do you see? Very often, people think that Christians believe in God based purely on their tradition or some sort of a comfort or a crutch, and that might be true to some extent. But the picture that we have here is God saying to Moses, don't just take my word for it just because of that. I'm going to back up everything I'm saying to you with action. And that might be at the center of the way God tells him what is, because Moses keeps saying, what am I going to say to these people? Nobody is going to believe the story that I saw a bush that was on fire but not consumed, and I heard the angel of God talk to me, and he said that he was going to deliver the people. How on earth am I going to demonstrate something enough that's going to prove that they'll actually listen to me and follow me? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now, you're probably familiar with that phrase. You've probably heard it a lot of times. It's actually enigmatic. It's hard to explain. The way it was originally said and the way it was originally constructed seems in some ways lost in the midst of time. And the best kind of scholarly guess at what is behind the construct is that it could be rendered, I am who I am and I will be who I will be. And God seems to be saying something in the order of to Moses, I I'm the God who just is absolute being. Now, I'm not going to spend a long time thinking about the philosophy of that, but for those of you curious about that, it's almost like he's saying, when you go back from one cause, I'm the God of your fathers, and okay, they are one generation after another, and that's who they give rise to, and everything in this creation has a cause of some kind. When you get to the bottom of that exercise, I am at the bottom of all of that. I am the God and the creator and the sustainer of the entire universe. I am the only being in all of what you know as the creation that is sustained by myself, that doesn't need anything else to sustain me. I am who I am, and say the I am has sent you. And it's a strange phrase, and it's meant to be, because it's only able to be uttered uniquely by God. But tucked into that, because the grammar in the Hebrew very likely also means that I am who I will be. What he's also saying to Moses is, when you and the people look towards the future, or you look back from a future place to now, you will see that I have been consistent with who I've said I would be. Or let me take another swing at that. In revealing himself, his identity and his name, he is saying that who I am is made up of complete integrity. So whatever I say to you I'm going to do in the future, you are going to be able to take that to the bank. I am going to bind myself to the promises that I make. I am going to give you a picture of myself that is so reliable and that is so sure that you are going to be able to take it, because you're going to have evidence that I'm going to stake my reputation on the acts that I'm going to do for you and your people. Does that make sense? God is saying to Moses that you and this people are going to have to learn that my personality and my being is not to be separated from my acts. They're all part of who I am. So if you're going to see me as a saving God, you're going to be able to say, that's exactly who he is. He's not a distant sky being. He is the God who gets down and comes here and acts because he sees and he hears our misery, and he decides to do something about it and to act on it. He's revealing himself as someone who is going to be right in the middle of this people's activity in the world. And this people at this time are struggling for survival. God has made these promises to Abraham that he would have all these children, they'd be more numerous than the stars of the sky, that God was always going to be present with them, that God was going to give them a land where they would have enough for everything, and all these questions hanging in the balance. And God is saying, I'm going to do all of that. In fact, as the one who creates everything and is the ground of all being in the universe, I'm the only one who's able to give you those things. And that is an amazing vision for us to have of God, because people are still struggling. People are still wrestling with a sense of ultimate identity. A lot of us and a lot of other people who aren't here, it's something that we're continually faced with. When I strip away maybe the other labels that I have or that I wear, whether that's the label I wear at work or that I did in my career, or who I am in relation to my family, who am I really? Where do I get my identity? And God is coming to Moses and to his people saying, look, as the one who is pure being, identity, I'm stable, I'm the same from one generation to the next, I can give you and your people all those things. I can give you an identity. I can give you the identity because you're connected to me. I can give you stability and security in a way that nothing and no one else in this world can. Because he's a God who hears and acts to give his people what they long for, what we all long for. And secondly, he's a God who saves. And that might seem perhaps even trite and obvious, and we know that from Jesus Christ, because he comes, as Paul says, as the final and full revelation of God. But he doesn't do that in the abstract. He does that for Moses here. Because Moses' biggest need here is not really to be wheeled out of the land of Egypt and get out of this awful situation. I think the writer's letting us know Moses has a bigger problem, because where is he? He's on the run. And God works to save him even through the mess that he's in. Moses was at this time tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law. So think about that. In the ancient world, tending the flock, shepherds, a despised class, completely looked down on. Somebody who has had the equivalent of had been to Eton in our kind of setup, they should be, well, maybe they shouldn't be, depending on your view, but custom would dictate that they should have a very powerful job, perhaps in Parliament. And he's nowhere. Why? Because he made this mistake and he's been on the run. He's gone from the guy who was filled with vim and vigor and confidence and righteous anger and zeal, and he overstepped the mark, and he made this tragic and what he probably thought was a fatal mistake. And he's gone from that to, well, look at the way he describes himself. But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He's gone from overconfidence to absolutely zero confidence. He doesn't believe in himself at all. He's literally in hiding and retreating, but also within himself and within his own psyche. He's just closing in like a shell, because he thinks it seems this one mistake should completely define him, given the change in his character. If you like, I think Moses is living in the trauma, in the after effects of what he's done. Quite often, soldiers who survive war zones and they have what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, it's not so much it's sometimes what they saw, and the man's inhumanity to man, but it's also in what they did and what they were able to do, what they saw themselves as being capable of that they didn't know they were capable of in order to survive. And that's the trauma that they live out of and that they struggle to be able to cope with. And it fundamentally changes a person's psyche and their view of themselves and what they believe about themselves. And I think that's exactly what's gone on with Moses. And what does God do with that? God doesn't just say, well, get a grip, Moses. I need you to do it, or obey me just because I'm God and I'm telling you to do it. God accommodates the struggle Moses is having. He still chooses him, and he still decides to bring this salvation through him. And God didn't need to do that. God is the I am. God sustains himself. God doesn't need anything or anyone, is really the picture that we get. But for whatever reason, he chooses to bring this salvation through Moses. And he comes to Moses' level and he says, okay, I can see you're struggling, Moses. I'm going to give you something here. God says, I will be with you. That is one of the most powerful phrases in all of Scripture. And more than that, number one, he promises him his presence. And number two, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. So this is what God does. He says, the I am, the one who's the creator of the universe, I'm going to be with you for a start. And if that wasn't enough, I'm going to give you something that you can hang on to. I'm going to give you something tangible. I'm going to give you a sign. You're going to actually tread this land again, and it's going to work because I'm staking my name on this. I'm the one who's going to do this. You see, time and time again we find in the Scriptures that the kind of people that you and I, if we were on an appointment board, might try and choose to deliver these outcomes, they don't make the cut. And it's people like Moses who are deeply flawed who do. He did something reprehensible, he committed murder, and then he becomes this shell and lacks confidence in himself or God. He's not an advert or a poster child for faith or faithfulness or even righteousness at this point. And God says, I choose you. Maybe it's that what we see time and time again, that it's that sort of breaking in that's happened, that kind of brokenness, that it seems to be attractive to God. And that's the kind of people God knows he can use. Now, Moses' problem isn't now that he's got too much confidence. It's that he's got so little. He's in the negative balance with confidence that he struggles even to trust God. And God is going to work on that and keep giving him signs. But can you see the gentleness and the approachableness of God, and how, even though, do you know how we're always hearing the God of the Old Testament is always just raging? We're in the Old Testament here, and God is accommodating himself and bringing himself close to Moses and doing it in a way that is cognizant of where Moses is and the trauma that he has suffered and is currently going through. I think that is so powerful. What's the takeaway for you and me? Well, firstly, we've thought about the fact that God hears and acts and can give us what we need the most in our lives. But secondly, God can save through anyone. And God can do great things in this world through anyone, or God can do ordinary things in this world through anyone. But he continues to choose to work through people like Moses. I certainly identify with Moses. Somebody who makes mistakes and doesn't think they're a poster child for faith or faithfulness. And yet God chooses to work through me, and God chooses to work through you. And I think the power of that is it doesn't matter what mistake you might have made. Essentially, God can still work through you. God can still come to you. God can still bring his salvation to you, and God can still use you as someone who's instrumental in bringing that salvation to others. That's the takeaway. Otherwise, why choose characters like that if it wasn't to demonstrate that no one and nothing is beyond redemption in our world? God works through people who are imperfect, deeply flawed, have made mistakes, lacking in self-confidence. I don't care how little confidence or how not great you think you are. God may well still have something for you to do. God may be able to do something that I was telling the children, that is only deployable and deliverable through you and not anyone else. So don't discount yourself or discredit yourself. Because you might think Moses is this hero, but I hope I've just demonstrated to you that actually that's not the whole picture. And there's more in this that's relatable than there is that's foreign. God works his salvation through people like us. And finally, and most briefly, God is a God who gives hope. He saves, he hears and acts, he saves through broken people, and he gives us hope. And I'm just going to read the same verse. I will be with you, and this will be the sign that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Where Moses is standing, it feels like a very far away reality that his people are ever going to be free, and that they're going to be, that's a picture of the garden, really. It's that being able to worship God without interruption, without interference, without chaos and evil and slavery, and with a kind of plentifulness of God's provision all around. And he's saying to Moses, essentially, Moses, you can hang your hat on this, that a day is coming where things are not going to look like this. And this is going to be the sign. You're going to be back standing on this ground, and what I'm promising you is actually going to materialize and happen. And in some sense, that is the big story, because we've talked about how Exodus connects to Genesis and continues the grand story of God's creation, what he's doing with humanity and the world. But that story ends up in Revelation with the new heavens and the new earth, which has a garden at the center of it, and people are worshiping God day and night, and there's nothing to interrupt it. And sin and tears and pain have been banished forever. And God, through Christ, comes to us and gives us that hope. I know that things may seem dark today and supremely difficult and perhaps insurmountable, but God is saying, I'm going to stake my reputation, and the fact that you can believe on me on this, that there is a day coming where it is not going to be like that. And I think all human beings, it's really one thing that we cannot live without is a bit of hope, especially when we're going through suffering and dark times. And foundational to the gospel, the good news, is that it actually gives us that hope. It might not mean that the circumstance and the situation that you're in right now is going to be immediately resolved. It might not be at the specific level of perhaps where even you would like it. It might not even help you understand why you're going through or suffering what you are right now. It may or it may not, but that's not really the hope. The hope at this broad level, which is applicable to all of us, is not for fame, fortune, riches, health, wealth, all the stuff that complete charlatans will sometimes promise in the name of religion. It is that we all live in this experience where the world and our world is broken, and it's not working, and it's not right, and we suffer injustice, and we see others suffering injustice. And the hope of the gospel is it is not always going to be like that. The promise is that God is going to remake the heavens and the earth, again, with that perfect vision of him at the center of it, where all the evil stuff is banished. And so, just like God promised that to Moses, you're going to be back here at Mount Horeb, which is Sinai, where he gives the law, and you guys are going to be worshiping me, and you're going to be free. He makes the same promise to us. He says, I know what you're going through right now. I know what you are particularly suffering. I know what your group are suffering. I know what your society are suffering. But I have a promise to you, if you flip to the end of the story and read it, that you're going to be back here on this ground. Because it's the goal of the Christian life is not on a cloud playing a harp in heaven forever. The goal, if we really read the story properly, is he's going to remake this world, and we'll be back here, and it's going to be different. The thing that was causing us pain and suffering and that we thought we could never get past, it is going to be remade. And that isn't just ethereal hope in the forever far away. Because of Jesus, that starts now. Because what does Jesus do? He did the same thing that God did for Moses. He comes into the brokenness and the suffering and the pain and the struggle that everyday people experience, and he says, this matters. And I'm going to start bringing goodness into the life of people and their experience in this world now. And my friends, that is really our commission as a church at this time. We do look forward to the day when God is going to remake all of this, and it's going to be better, and the bad stuff will be gone. And we're not going to see that probably today or tomorrow or the day after. But what we are able to do is, because we are reconnected with the God who was speaking to Moses and gave us Christ and remade us, we are able to be agents of that new world, of that new heavens and new earth just now. And wherever we see suffering, injustice, people struggling and in pain and in difficulty, we are able to come into that and come alongside it, because we have that hope and we know that that's where it's headed. So we think, well, why not be part of that just now? Why not start remaking the ground that we're standing on in the image and in the likeness of the perfect kingdom of love and of justice and of goodness, that God is going to remake it anyway? Because, back to point 2, how does God choose to do all of this? Through us, me and you, the ordinary people. It's through us that he's going to do it and to remake it. People who are called, ordinary people who are called by Christ, just like Moses was called by the Lord, in order to make the world a better place through his salvation. May God bless this word to us this morning. Amen.